The fact that you're listening to Revolution Health Radio tells me that you care about health as a topic, but also as an issue. The current medical model is no match for the challenges it faces today, let alone tomorrow. We'll always need doctors, but what we need now is an army of healthcare professionals skilled in helping people make diet and lifestyle changes that could literally save their lives. What if you could earn a living making an impact like that? You can. It's the job of a health coach, and they play a critical role in the future of medicine. Now, not everyone who's fascinated by functional medicine wants to do it for a living, but the people who end up pursuing a coaching career start where you are, curious, passionate, and driven to make a difference in people's lives and on the future of healthcare. I consider it my mission to give health coaches the skills they need to make a difference. That's why I created the Adapt Health Coach Training Program, an online 12-month certification that will prepare you for a successful career as a health coach. Unconventional solutions require unconventional people, and if you're one of them and get excited about the idea of building a career and a business by helping other people make real and lasting changes, we need you desperately. Becoming a health coach could change your life. It could also change the world. Go to kresser.co/success to learn more. That's KRESSER.co/success. Hey everybody, Chris Kresser here. This week I'm really excited to welcome Dallas Hartwig as my guest. Dallas is the New York Times bestselling co-author of The Whole 30, and It Starts with Food. He's a sought-after speaker, nutritionist, functional medicine practitioner, and physical therapist who specializes in treating lifestyle-related health issues. And he's appeared on Good Morning America, The Dr. Oz Show, The View, and Nightline, and is the co-host of the Living Experiment podcast. I really enjoyed this conversation with Dallas, and while in some ways it's a bit of a departure from the topics that we normally discuss on the show, I think it's highly relevant for the times during this COVID-19 crisis. One note, we had a little bit of an audio problem during the recording. My microphone seemed to go on the fritz somehow. I'm not sure how that happened, but hopefully it's not too distracting. We did our best to clean it up in post-production, but it's definitely not up to our normally high standard. So hope you're able to still enjoy the show. It's one of my favorite episodes that I've ever recorded, actually, in the almost 10 years of doing this podcast. So without further delay, I bring you Dallas Hartwig.
Dallas Hartwig, it's a pleasure to have you on the show. It's been a while since we've connected.
It has. I think we've just been doing lots of things, and you moved, and
doing our stuff.
Yeah.
Let's take a step back, and I love to get the history and the backstory. So, when I originally met you, it was through the paleo nutrition lifestyle movement, if you will, and we'd see each other at Paleo FX, and you were instrumental, co-founder of Whole 30, and It Starts with Food. And then I think we haven't been in touch as much over the past few years, and I know that you've you're still interested in all of that too, but your path has sort of taken a new direction. So I'd love to hear about what inspired that new direction for you. What is that new direction, and how did it culminate in writing this new book, The 4-Season Solution?
Well, that's a fun and really big question. I think there's kind of two parts to it. I'll answer the question you asked, and then I'll answer the question you didn't ask.
Great.
Fair
enough.
What I've been kind of working on, obviously leading up to the release of the 4-Season Solution, is kind of taking and stepping back from nutrition as a focus, and stepping back even from specific health behaviors as a focus, and saying, okay, what do we need to do to live in this crazy modern world with success, with peace, with feeling kind of gratified and like we belong to our lives in a way that feels really deep and good. And I don't think that the answer to living a sane, healthy, balanced life is in more physiological research and diving deeper into the genome and all that kind of stuff. That can undoubtedly give us more understanding and more information about how our bodies work and what to do with them. But I don't suspect This is just a plain suspicion. I don't suspect that the answers to people's woes lies in getting progressively more granular. And I describe the Four Seasons solution as the prequel to It Starts with Food. So it's kind of the conceptual framework that predates my specific work on nutrition, because, as the title of the first book kind of would suggest, it only starts with food. It's the starting point. And there's all of these other lifestyle areas to address, but those are just starting points. Even if I'd written it starts with sleep, and then I'd written it starts with movement, and I'd written it starts with connection, all of those things would only be starting points. And really, the larger framework that I wrote about in the Four Seasons Solution is this way of integrating these pieces into what I think is a simple integrated system. It's not simple and integrated because I'm some kind of crazy genius. It's because I just looked at the natural world and said, oh, this is how it works. And that's what we did so much of in the paleo and ancestral health communities, is we looked at the natural world and we said, oh, this is how it works in the natural world. What can we glean, and what ideas and patterns can we bring with us into the modern world? And this is just more of that same premise for me, but with a broader umbrella.
Yeah, it's really fascinating to hear you talk about that, because I'd say we've been on similar journey in the sense of moving from granular to more general principles,
Right.
foundational principles that can certainly include a granular approach when it's necessary and helpful, but is really more about pulling the lens, zooming out a little
Yeah.
bit and looking at the patterns and the principles more so than the percentage of carbohydrates, or
Right.
whether you do 16-8 or
Right.
12 intermittent fasting. And look, I think we'll both agree that people can get a lot of benefit from those things, but
Certainly.
it seems that the exclusive focus on that, final 5 or 10% of how you might adjust your diet can actually preclude a focus on some other areas that might even be more transformative or more fruitful.
Well, I totally agree. And I might go one step further, and I might say the focus on perpetually tweaking our lifestyle, whether that is movement or sleep or nutritional supplementation or, diet more generally, or the way that we interact with, radiation, or like all of these things that like we could think about and get really granular with in the modern world. I would say that we could get so granular with any of those things and all of those things collectively so as to preclude us from really living. And that's kind of my personal and kind of conceptual pushback against kind of the sort of biohacking to excess kind of way of living, is that and this is just totally my personal opinion, but it seems to really get in the way of doing much more interesting things other than focusing on the things at the very base of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right?
Yeah.
Because all of the things that we're like, all of this health stuff is really just that very first or maybe second layer, the very foundational stuff. And so the question that you didn't ask, but I'm going to answer anyway, about what I've kind of been up to the last little bit is also, yes, kind of putting my ideas into a book about how to integrate and oscillate these lifestyle pieces. But really, my personal and kind of creative journey leads me to places that are far more conceptual and relational and psychological in nature, because for my own personal interest and my own kind of interest in writing about and sharing my thoughts with the world, I'm no longer interested in health as a primary focus. It is foundational. I don't think anyone would disagree that it's foundational, but it's only foundational. So the other stuff that I've been kind of thinking about and reading about and doing personal work on has been the higher order things in Maslow's hierarchy of needs, of thinking about legacy and belonging and community building and contribution and mentorship and some of these sorts of things that I'm not necessarily self-appointing myself into, but those are the things I'm thinking about and interested in, because those are the things that as we sort of transcend ourselves, we start to get to a place of a real sense of deep purpose and contribution to something larger than ourselves, and often larger and beyond our own lifetimes. So that's the stuff that I'm thinking about these days.
Yeah, that was actually my next question. So thanks for asking it. And I'm going to ask you another version of it, or to go deeper in it at least. And I think we're really on the same page with this. I call what you're referring to the end of the me project,
Yeah.
which is everything that we're talking about here, like this, myopic maybe focus on tweaking every last aspect of our diet and our lifestyle and our behavior, our sleep, physical activity, can again just be kind of utterly consuming and overwhelming. And it's all me, 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 me.
Totally.
And we know from so many different angles, whether it's actual research. I mean, you can look at research showing that social connection, lack of social connection, for example, is a greater risk for early death than smoking 15 cigarettes a day.
Right.
So, and where does that fit into this discussion of lifestyle? And we know that there was an interesting article that just came out in the New York Times looking at service and volunteering, and how people who volunteer during times of crisis, this was COVID related, of course, not only feel a greater sense of purpose and meaning in their lives, they actually cope better with crisis than people who are not actively engaged in service. And, we know this from the mystics, the importance of shifting focus away from our own egocentric desires and self-improvement to, benefiting humankind is like part of the process of awakening, and part of, becoming more fully human. And it's so interesting to me that that your journey has taken you here. And I'd love to hear a little bit more, if you're willing to share, about what prompted this. What was there a particular moment? Were there a series of moments that led to this shift in your focus?
Yeah, it's a great question. There was definitely a series of moments, and I just want to kind of clarify. I'm not to the end of the me project. I am. I like to think that I'm wrapping up the last couple chapters of the me project in terms of, for me at this point, it's no significant focus on my physical health, and it's purely a psychological and emotional healing experience for me. And for me personally, just with my story, that looks like meditation and psychotherapy, and lots of time spent in nature, and lots of time spent behind my camera doing creative work and appreciating the natural world and the beauty that's all around us. And for me, that's a sort of meditative practice. And it is being a half-time single parent and trying to kind of do the best job that I can do as a father. And more broadly, it's saying, okay, I very much recognize from a sort of career track perspective that this focus on health is not something that I am going to continue as a primary, as a solitary focus. But that does leave a big gaping hole where I'm not quite sure what exactly that new thing is. So I'm very much in a transitionary spot. To answer your question a little more directly about what sort of prompted my shifting, it was a series of realizations over the last 5 or so years that my deepest fear was that the rest of my life would look like the first half. And, kind of the obvious implication there is that I needed to make some changes in the way that I was living. And that I didn't even know what that meant or where to start with that. So I've done a great deal of rededicating myself to the me project in the sort of psycho-spiritual sphere, and not so much in the physiological sphere. But the project really is the same. And it's interesting that, we touched briefly on the sort of getting too granular, because I did that in the sort of psycho-emotional sphere as well. I got too granular and too self-focused and too almost obsessive about learning about my psyche and healing my childhood trauma and that kind of stuff. And so there was a rebalancing that had to take place, and to a certain extent is still taking place for me in that sphere as well. And that's why I say I'm not to the end of the Me project. I'm just getting closer to it, because I do need to continue to kind of heal and integrate stuff. And I look back on my life and I say, man, how did I, I'm 41 now, and how did I survive 4 decades on Earth with such limited skills? Like, how did I do that? And then and then like, oh, right, because it sucked most of the time, because I just didn't know, kind of how to be a grounded, sane, loving human. And so yeah, my process has been deeply personal. And, in my 20s and most of my 30s, I was extremely resistant to and almost antagonistic to any sort of spiritual reality. I was sort of a hardcore rationalist, atheist, and that's very much shifted and changed for me. But I'm not quite sure where I land. So this is very procedural for me. I'm very much in it. So there's the there's the behind the scenes look.
Yeah, thank you for that. It's generous of you to share that, and I'm always very interested in the meta process that goes on. Not just
Right.
where we end up and what the milestones are along the path, but what was happening internally to get us there. And in my own experience, and certainly to be clear, like the end of the Me project's kind of a flippant, quick way of referring to what we're
Right.
talking about, because it's we can't live without ego. Ego is a focusing and centralizing force that allows us to still stay coherent.
Right.
If we're completely without ego, we're kind of dissolved and probably in a not here anymore in
Right.
one
Totally.
fashion or another. So
Right.
we need that, and we need also still to attend to our health in various ways. Of course, I'm not suggesting. I think people who who listen to this podcast know my work know that I still think that that's critical and important for most people, and it will kind of, in my experience, ebb and flow the level of attention that's needed, and be different for each different person. So if we take somebody who has just been diagnosed with a chronic illness and is has been living a relatively unconscious life as it pertains to health and wellness, then that person would be probably very well served by paying more attention to what they eat and how they sleep and all of that. What happened for me in my own journey with very severe complex chronic illness, and then also now in treating patients with chronic complex illnesses for 15 years, is that I came to realize that at some point, once you've done all of those things, doing more and more of them is generally not going to provide the greatest return on your time and energy investment,
Right.
so to speak. And that for many of my patients, and for me at one point in my journey, it made way more sense to shift the focus to a lot of the things that you're talking about, to our psychological, emotional, and even spiritual well-being, and to loosen the grip on some of the other diet, lifestyle, and behavioral factors, especially insofar as that can free up more of our energy and time to focus on those things that are higher on Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And
Totally.
the amazing thing, and I'm curious if this has been true for you, for me and for many of my patients, is that in doing that, a lot of the health stuff actually improved.
Yes,
Where it was
sure.
not before. So
For sure.
it's somewhat counterintuitive that if we zoom out and don't focus as much on the ostensible things that lead to physical, health and well-being, that actually we might arrive there more quickly or more fully.
For sure.
So what has your experience been like with that?
Yeah, that's been exactly the same, as far as recognizing that there is a place you can go that is obsessive and unbalanced, and ultimately antithetical to the end goal of living a grounded, healthy, gratifying life. And that's not to say that that is the way to live. That's just what matters to me.
Yeah.
And I think, to your point about, kind of a little bit kind of backing off of the obsessive stuff about health specifically, that both helped me in my own physical health, just to not push that as much. It's interesting in the realm of child development and psychology, there's this concept of attachment theory. And I don't know if you've ever covered that here, but Winnicott talks about this idea of a good enough parent. It's written as detachment research in several different places. But a good enough parent is a parent that is present and compassionate and attentive and supportive most of the time. And, and that's not all the time. It's not a perfect parent. You don't have to get it right all the time, but there's this concept of good enough. And just that phrasing kind of struck me, because in the society now, and it was probably different 50 years ago, but now to say something's good enough sounds very like dismissive and like you're giving up. And, and I think we would all do well to recognize that good enough is actually a tremendous achievement in different areas of our life. And whether that is we have reached the place where our nutritional strategy is good enough, what that does is it frees up resources, time, energy, attention, willpower, whatever, to do other things. And there's so many facets to being a human that freeing up energy from one area and being able to allocate it somewhere else, to me, is a tremendous sign of growth and success. So if you can get your lifestyle from a sort of healthy lifestyle standpoint to a good enough place, I think that's an amazing achievement. And I think that concept, even though I didn't write about it specifically in the 4-season solution, it's very much there in the background, that the premise with the 4-season solution is that this is how you can live a good enough life in all of these 4 basic areas of healthy living, such that you have tremendously enhanced bandwidth and interest and energy and sort of life force to apply to far more interesting, complex, nuanced, and uniquely human experiences. So yeah, there's that kind of that good enough concept that has sort of really stuck with me over the years, and is in the background of a lot of my work now.
Yeah, that's a great frame. And of course, different people have different values, and all you can speak to is what is meaningful for you, and the same for me, right? For me, the people I most admire are the people who have found that good enough in the greatest number of areas in their life.
Yeah.
There are many people in the world who have been absolutely phenomenal and even peerless in one area of their life, of a particular achievement, right? And I admire that, and I think we need that to some extent in the world. And yet I don't aspire to be that person myself, because the sacrifice that is made is that, the other areas of life for that person are usually a total catastrophe. So
absolutely,
you think of someone, I didn't know Steve Jobs personally, but, I read his biography, and somebody like that who just made just incredible accomplishments in a particular area of his life, but also didn't seem to relate very well to other people, at least in a way that I respect and aspire to relate. And of course, we hear all the time about spiritual teachers of various denominations that have attained a high level of understanding or awakening or awareness in a certain realm, but then they're sleeping with their students, and their relationships are disasters, or they're abusing financially, they've embezzled money from their organization or whatever. And we know of people who maybe are extreme, like the picture of what we aspire to in terms of physical health and achievement, athletics or whatever, but their lives are kind of falling apart in lots of other different ways. And so this notion of like what it means to be healthy, to me, has been really interesting to explore. And one of the I still don't have a definition that I completely am 100% comfortable with, but I think the one that gets closest to me is from Moshe Feldenkrais, who's the founder, of course, the Feldenkrais method. He defined health, I'm going to paraphrase it, but as the ability to live your dreams. And that's just really fascinating for me to contemplate, because it shifts the idea of health as the absence of disease or the absence of physical symptoms or limitations to a much broader
Yeah.
perspective of how you can be a fulfilled, happy, and well person in the world.
That's so great, and certainly, and so in line with the way I view, kind of some of these kind of basic health and lifestyle factors. And I don't remember actually if I actually wrote the specific phrase into the book at this point, but something I've talked a lot about and thought a lot about is this space, that the idea that when people, and this is drawing largely from my observations of people who completed the Whole30, hundreds of thousands of times I saw, from a both personal and sort of distance online perspective, I saw people take 30 days to eat different food and spontaneously transform into totally different people. And I'm certain that you've seen this thousands of
Mm-hmm.
times in your own practice. And that observation really struck me, because I'm like, all we're doing is eating different food for 1 month out of your whole life, and the spontaneity with which these changes, these transformations, these motivations, these ideas, this new energy came to people, like it was spontaneous. We didn't direct people to think about changing careers or restarting their creative practice or reassessing their unhealthy relationship. We just told people and gave people supportive resources to eat different food, and that other thing happened spontaneously. And I think, and that's very much informed all of my subsequent work, because I think what happens with humans is when we get closer to alignment with our natural way of being, however you want to define that, and that's obviously very personal, variable personally. But when we get closer to that place, the effortfulness of living starts to really decrease, and the doors start to kind of open for us, metaphorically speaking. So I think that when we are able to put some of these basic lifestyle factors into place in a way that really works for us, then we can have that spontaneous, I guess, ascension, or, because humans are so naturally buoyant that if we're stuck and sort of submerged in the muck of the modern world, when we can cut away some of those unhealthy, destructive anchors that are holding us down and holding us in place, we spontaneously rise. And I think that lack of limitation really aligns with Feldenkrais's comment there about health, that like we can then go and do whatever we are destined to do, if you believe in destiny.
Right, exactly. And it's also true, I imagine you would agree with this, that even if we can't resolve our chronic pain or our chronic illness in the full sense, meaning like if we can't attain a cure, that need not hold us back from living our dreams.
Right.
And all you have to do is look at history to find abundant examples of this. In fact, I'm actually writing, starting to think about my third book, and this is part of the research that I'm doing for that book. Virtually everyone we've heard of from history had some kind of physical or emotional or psychological struggle that they dealt with.
Mm-hmm.
And my hypothesis is that it is through the relationship with that struggle and the transformation that occurred as a result of that struggle that they were actually able to obtain greatness and achieve what they did.
Yeah.
Not in spite of it, but because of it.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I totally agree with that, and I love that premise, and I can't wait to read your work on that. I remember, this is years ago now, 5+ years ago. I was speaking to a group of Navy SEALs who were asking questions, and it was the SEALs and their partners, and they were asking a little bit about sort of resiliency and relationship stress related to coming home from deployment and some of that kind of stuff. And there was a question about, like, because they were talking about how so much conflict arises when they kind of come back to the real world, so to speak. And one of the gentlemen asked, like, my wife and I don't really ever have conflict. Like, we don't ever fight. We don't ever kind of, struggle with that. Like, is that okay? And and I answered it carefully, because I was talking to person in a front of a live audience, you know, so there was sort of a degree of kind of compassion and gentleness there. But I don't think that the lack of struggle or conflict in a romantic relationship is any indication of its health or success. And the analogy that I used in that particular instance was talking about, and I think I delivered it awkwardly, but I basically said that like that's the equivalent of sort of relational sedentarism. You know, because in the same way as our physical bodies need the movement and challenge and resistance of gravity and external devices to kind of maintain our functionality, we need that same thing sort of psycho-emotionally. And, you know, whether we're talking about Viktor Frankl or Helen Keller or anybody else that you might write about, there's a tremendous amount of psycho-emotional exertion that takes place to deal with the realities and the challenges of their situation. So I applaud that train of thought. So I love it.
I've also, we launched a health coach training program a couple of years ago, and initially when a lot of people come into it, they figure they're going to learn to, prescribe nutrition plans and make diet
right.
lifestyle recommendations and all that. And they do learn that, to be fair. It's an important part of the program. But what they may not know and expect is that they're going to learn how to build trust and rapport in a relationship, how to deeply listen to somebody and reflect what they're hearing in a way that creates that kind of mutual understanding and trust, how to be an ally for somebody and a guide rather than an expert that just tells them what to do, how to really listen to someone so that you're getting to the true needs that they're trying to express rather than just, the surface level observations maybe that
right.
you might take away from the conversation, how to help people to resolve ambivalence and overcome obstacles. I mean, what we consistently hear from people as they go through the course is like, this changed my life, like in ways that I had I was not expecting at all. And those are the aspects actually of this work that are so transformative and so exciting to me at this point, that because they include all of the diet and lifestyle stuff, but they go so far beyond that.
Totally.
And it sounds like that's, a frame that you are really working with right now.
No doubt. No doubt.
So let's talk a little bit about the seasons, because that's another frame, right? There's probably many different frames that you could have chosen as a way of talking about this stuff in your book, and you chose the seasons. So tell us a little bit about how seasons and an awareness of seasons can inform the way that we approach these topics.
Yeah. So, I think you and I share some of the same sort of historical DNA of really recognizing the value and wisdom, both sort of in a literal sense, encoded in our DNA from a sort of an evolutionary history standpoint, and then also sort of more broadly and sort of culturally and socially. But I chose, well, first of all, I'll kind of back up and say my early life history of living in effectively a homestead. My parents had a cabin on 100 acres with no electricity and no running water.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, and we were deeply connected to the earth because you can't not be. We lived in Eastern Ontario, and it gets cold and dark in the winter and hot and muggy in the summer. And there's a pretty significant variation in length of day across the course of the seasons, and particularly the absence of artificial light really grounds you into that cycle, into that rhythm. And later in my childhood and in my young adulthood, I totally abandoned that connection and that way of living and became very conventional, to great detriment to myself. But that was kind of always in the background. And so when I started to look at the world, particularly through an evolutionary biology lens, the more layers of circadian biology and the sort of rhythmic aspects of things that got layered in there, the more I started to see emerging patterns of, at its most basic level, expansion and contraction. And then with a little more complexity, kind of different phases within the expansion, different phases within the contraction. And it started to look a lot like what happens across the course of a year in a temperate climate where we have 4 seasons. And, really the concept was basically so much of our behavior, both in very tangible ways, like what foods we eat, but then also in less tangible, but equally important ways in terms of the way we connect with ourselves, the way we are either looking outward and focusing on kind of social connections out there with relative superficiality with a huge number of people, or we are more withdrawn and closer to home and contracted and deeply connected to ourselves and our place and our home and those people who are most important and closest to us. The more I looked at all of that stuff in sort of this big soup of health behaviors, the more I recognized that there was a pretty consistent pattern that nested nicely into the 4 annual seasons. And the more I looked at the sort of motivational and psycho-emotional parts of that, the more I recognize that happens on a 24-hour pattern. And it also happens on this longer kind of lifetime timeline. And I'm very interested with repeating in repeating patterns. And so there is a sort of a fractal aspect to this where that expansion contraction cycle happens on a literal physical level every single day that we wake up. We go from a very small, safe, kind of home bed environment to going out into the world, exploring and exposing ourselves to new ideas and new people, and then bringing important things, ideas and resources home and contracting again and being really present to the people most important to us. And that cycle occurs across the course of a year and across the course of a lifetime. And so as I was doing my own personal journeying in the last few years, what I noticed was that as I was getting around 40, or kind of coming up to 40, there were new thoughts and queries and wonderings showing up in my head about where do I go from here? What's next? And there's became this shift away from working hard, being successful, doing the thing, and kind of being in a very intensely summer-like go, go, go kind of mode. And there became this, and it's still present for me, but there was this sort of upwelling of desire to think about slowing down and reconnecting and sort of contracting my life into a place that felt better for me. And then I just started to look, and I'm like, everywhere I looked, I saw the same pattern. And so that's what I tried to convey in the book, is this idea that the seasons, while they are literal and biological, they're also metaphorical, and sort of almost archetypes in and of themselves. So then I gave sort of symbolic placeholders to each of the seasons. And in the sort of hormone and neurotransmitter realm, spring is so much about dopamine and excitement and energy and motivation and novelty seeking and the draw towards things, the sort of anticipatory feeling. And then that draws us into the full scale frontal assault of summer, which is all about adrenaline and cortisol and stress and focus and productivity and doing the thing. And of course, each of those hormones helps us adapt to and be successful in that particular phase. And unfortunately and tragically, most of civilization, the kind of the modern world, is built around spring and summer, perpetual expansion, dopamine and adrenaline, stress, productivity, acquisition, accumulation of wealth, all of that kind of stuff. And we forget that there is an equal and opposite contraction phase, the fall and winter of, and fall is so much about serotonin and connection and community and belonging and gratitude and generosity. And those types of things are so nicely illustrated in the tradition of Thanksgiving, because Thanksgiving is the harvest celebration and the generosity and the connection and the grounding and the homecoming. And I think there's still elements of that there, but it's become a much stranger and unrecognizable thing in modern world. But fall is that experience, and then the serotonin gets both biochemically and also metaphorically transformed into melatonin, and then there is this deeply healing, restorative, maximally contracted state of winter and of sleep, different timelines. And that's super important because it allows us to fully rejuvenate and restore ourselves and detoxify ourselves and really recover from the stressors of either the earlier part of the day or the earlier part of the year or the earlier part of our lifetime, such that we can emerge in the next literal or metaphorical morning or spring, rejuvenated, energetic, and having that spring titillation energy. And I think one of the things that often comes up for readers and commenters is that there's an important reframe there for the end of our lives, because we think about death and mortality, and we think about it in this very dark, morbid way, and we mostly try to avoid thinking about it at all, and we get caught up with the cult of youth. But really, there's an opportunity there, and this kind of speaks to the looking beyond ourselves, sort of transcendence of self kind of experience, because the fall into the winter of our lives doesn't have to be a sad, morbid kind of experience. It can be the recognition that we can spend those later years of our life contributing to and setting the stage for a beautiful, energized, healthful, and really vital next generation. And I think that's what I find as a really beautiful idea, and I think an important reframe when it comes to mortality.
So beautifully articulated, and I can speak personally to those cycles. In my move to Utah, I experienced my first true winter ever in my life. I grew up in Southern California, where there's just different versions of summer throughout the year. A warmer summer and then a colder summer. 300 days of sunshine a year, and I've lived for short periods of time in other places that had more of a winter. I lived in the Bay Area, and there's arguably more seasonality there, but not to the extent of somewhere like Utah, right? And it was just a deeply healing and restorative season for me. I worked way less. I slowed way down. I spent a ton of time outside, which I know is not necessarily consistent with the winter rubric, but in Utah it is. There's plenty of opportunities. So I was skiing a lot, and that felt really good to be on the mountain and connected to nature in that way. And it just really struck me, like going through that whole experience, how, as you said, I think how starved many of us, and I was, for that kind of cyclical shift that naturally happens. And because we have artificial light, and because we have a kind of 24/7 always on mentality in our culture, that so many of us miss out on the opportunity to experience that. My wife actually spent over 10 years on a small little island in BC. You probably know of it, Dallas Island.
Nice.
She built her own house there and lived a very rural, bucolic lifestyle, where there's no power on the island other than the power you generate yourself. There's no car. There's no car ferry. So people have cars, but a lot of times they walk or ride their bikes. And she would talk about winters there, and it was probably like what you experienced on the homestead growing up, where people just kind of hunker down. They spend a lot of time reading, contemplating the mysteries of life, hanging out with each other, having meals together, and everything just slows down. And when she moved out from Mesquite into the Bay Area, it was a shock. I mean, I think it took her years to kind of readjust, and even now is still kind of yearning for that more explicit and in some ways enforced seasonal rhythm.
Right. Well, and I think that's the thing, right? Is that we have, and we have this mismatch, and, in the paleo and ancestral health communities, we've long talked about this whole concept of evolutionary mismatch. And it's especially referred to in the terms of nutrition, where, our bodies are evolved to expect a certain food source, and we give it something totally different and wonder why the results come out wonky. But there are mismatches not just between sort of our evolutionary past and our current modern environment, but there are also mismatches within our modern choices in different areas, different venues, different facets of our life. And that was something that I observed a lot in the ancestral health community, is that I would, you'd see people doing a, let's say a paleo type diet or a low carb, high fat kind of diet, but then they would be doing a huge amount of glycolytic physical activity. And I was like, well, hold on, over the course of time, and I'm sure you saw this in your clinical practice too, over the course of time, some of the mismatches between different aspects of our healthy living really started to clash against each other and really create problems. And so I'm kind of veering off in a different direction here, I guess, but jumping off from the sort of the way the world is wired, the way that we have built this civilized modern world, almost requires us to be deliberately almost contrarian, because pretty much everything that we do in the realm and with the ethos of perpetual expansion will eventually lead us to the wrong place. Because in as much as shifting, and let's say to a low carb, high fat dietary approach might actually be a really important and helpful adaptive strategy for some people for some period of time, what invariably happens is that over the course of time, that same strategy, when overextended, when extended beyond its natural adaptive phase, becomes problematic. And so, you talked about sort of this idea of it being enforced that there are seasons. And I think what I'm trying to do with the 4-season solution is not so much enforce it, but draw people's attention to the fact that when we recognize the natural environmental inputs, and the change in the light dark cycle is a good example, when we recognize the importance of those things and we allow them to influence us to a greater degree than when we're completely divorced from it in the modern world with artificial light and temperature controlled homes and all of this stuff, we then have access to a whole other realm of this is circling back to our early part of the conversation, but a whole other realm of ways of being in the world, ways of living, ways of existing, because we remove some of the friction between those mismatched components. And so I love your story, your illustration there of your wife's experience, because we really have to do that exact thing. We have to remove the roadblocks really that we have built into the modern world. And that requires us to be extremely unconventional. And I'll kind of shout out to my podcast co-host, Pilar Gerasimo, who recently published a book called The Healthy Deviant. And she talks extensively about what we need to do to be unconventional in a world that simply isn't working for people. And I think listeners of this podcast will probably largely agree that like the way we're doing it isn't working well. And there's much argument and discussion about how to do it well for any particular person's goals, but we're off track. And so this book is an attempt to kind of provide a simple template for people to recalibrate in ways that feel natural and healthy for them, much in the way that your family has done this past winter.
Yes. Dallas, I've really enjoyed this conversation. I hope all of the listeners have as well. Where can people learn more about your book and pick up a copy?
So the 4-season solution is available at Amazon and Barnes & Noble and independent bookstores everywhere. Right now, if you can find an independent bookstore online, that would be what I would really encourage readers to do to really support the independent booksellers. And there's also more information at my website, dallashartwig.com. I'm moderately active on Instagram at Dallas Hartwig. And other than that, I'm head down trying to figure out how to do this human thing.
Yes, great. Well, please keep sharing with us. I'm sure a lot of people have benefited from this, hearing more about your process. And, we're all on this journey together. And so to the extent that we can share what's been helpful and illuminating for us, I think that's can always be useful for others.
Awesome.
So thank you again for your time.
Thank you so much.
Pleasure to have you on the show.
Thanks very much.
Hey, everybody. Thanks for listening. Continue to send your questions in, chriskresser.com/podcast question. We'll talk to you next time.
That's the end of this episode of Revolution Health Radio. If you appreciate the show and want to help me create a healthier and happier world, please head over to iTunes and leave us a review. They really do make a difference. If you'd like to ask a question for me to answer on a future episode, you can do that at chriskresser.com/podcast question. You can also leave a suggestion for someone you'd like me to interview there. If you're on social media, you can follow me at twitter.com/Chris Kresser or facebook.com/Chris Kresser LAC. I post a lot of articles and research that I do throughout the week there that never makes it to the blog or podcast, so it's a great way to stay abreast of the latest developments. Thanks so much for listening. Talk to you next time.